I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality and the Socialist Equality Party. My name is Zach Ambides. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party, and I'll be chairing tonight's discussion. This is the fifth and the final event in the five-part series that has been organized by the IYSSE and the SEP entitled Capitalism's War on Society, Why You Need to Fight for Socialism. The previous four lectures have all now been posted on the IYSSE Australia Facebook page. They are all available to be viewed and reviewed as they contain critical issues that confront the working class, young people and students in this period. The first lecture, the coronavirus pandemic, the necessity for socialism, followed by our second lecture, the Russian Revolution and its significance for today. Thirdly, the socialist alternative and the politics of the pseudo-left. Finally, socialism versus identity politics and postmodernism, which was last week's lecture. And now we will open this meeting up for questions and contributions and discussion from those who are participating here tonight. Now, we are very pleased that we are joined here tonight by Joseph Kishore, who is the Socialist Equality Party's presidential candidate in the current US elections. Now, as Joe and Narissa Santa Cruz, who is the SEP's vice presidential candidate, noted when they announced their campaigns, the US elections are truly an international event, as the outcome affects everyone on the earth, and so everyone, by necessity, should be able to take part. In tonight's discussion, Nick Beams, who is now, I'm sure, very well known to all of us here, a National Committee member of the SEP, is being joined by Cheryl Crisp, who is the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP and a long-standing member and leader of the Trotskyist movement. They'll be putting questions to Joe in relation to his campaign and why he and the SEP is standing in the US elections. After some discussion, we will then be able to turn the lecture over to take your questions. So to start us off, I'll hand over to Nick, if you want to give us your first question for Comrade Joe.
Well, let me add my very warm welcome to you, Joe, and to everyone online tonight. I'd just like to begin, if you could just give us an outline, and I know there are many things to cover, but an outline of the present situation in the US with regard to COVID-19, and in particular, the return to work drive by the Trump administration and other sections of the political establishment.
Yes, greetings, Nick and Zach and everyone listening to this call. I'm very happy to be able to participate in this meeting. And as Zach said, we initiated our election campaign on the basis of the conception that this was not just a national campaign, but an international campaign, and the issues facing workers and young people all over the world are the same. And I think certainly the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic and the criminal response of ruling elites around the world has demonstrated very concretely the correctness of this conception and the correctness of the necessity for socialism. The need to respond to the crisis of capitalism by building a socialist movement in the international working class. To address your question, in the United States, the situation is really quite extraordinary. In terms of the pandemic itself, there are now more than 800,000 or nearly 800,000 cases in the United States, which is approximately a third of the total number of cases internationally. Every day brings something on the order of 2,000 or more deaths. There are already over 42,000 people who have died from this horrific virus, and it continues to expand. There are many indications that that there is a significant undercounting of both the number of new cases and the number of deaths. You have horrific reports coming in of the impact on nursing homes, the spread of the virus in prisons. There was just a report yesterday that in one Ohio prison, 73% of the inmates have tested positive. In terms of deaths, there are many people who are dying at home, and this is true internationally, but I think particularly in the United States, there are people dying at home who are not being tested and therefore not being counted as deaths from the coronavirus. There is no doubt continued widespread community transmission. The number of cases in Massachusetts is growing. There are reports of widespread transmission among meatpacking workers in Colorado, South Dakota, Iowa, and other states. And it's under these conditions that there is a mad dash to return to work, as Nick said. Spearheaded by the Trump administration, every day there are press briefings in which the president declares the necessity to return to work. In fact, there are already measures that have already been taken. In the state of Washington, there are already 27,000 workers at Boeing who have returned to work. State governors in Florida, in New Orleans, in Georgia, Tennessee, Vermont, and other states are quickly moving or have already moved to resume some businesses. The president has declared that May 1st is the target date for a significant reopening of the economy. The administration released last week so-called guidelines for a nationally coordinated campaign to return to work, which, as we've noted, really brings to an end any pretense of a systematic and coordinated effort to save lives in the United States through social distancing measures. And these policies will lead to death. They will lead to significant resurgences of the pandemic. All epidemiologists and scientists warn against warn of the danger and the cost to human life, which will come from these measures. But the ruling elite, and not just the Trump administration, but the Democratic Party, many of those states that are beginning already to open are run by Democratic governors, including where I'm speaking here in Michigan. The ruling class is determined to force workers back to work, to pump up profits, to pay for the trillions of dollars that they have handed themselves through Wall Street bailouts. And the media, they are engaged in a coordinated effort to try to shut down the safety measures that have been implemented to contain the virus. That's of course, there's a lot more that could be said about the situation, but that's the overall framework here in the United States.
Hi, Joe, it's Cheryl, and I'd also like to welcome. We've actually had a couple of questions from previous lectures pertaining to the US elections and why we stand. And one of the questions was, why does the SEP stand candidates in the US elections? And a question from a supporter in China asked why the SEP doesn't support the Democrats against Trump.
We are standing in the elections in order to advance and fight for a socialist program, a socialist response in the working class, to build a socialist leadership in the working class. Our orientation is towards the development of the class struggle. We've referred to the coronavirus pandemic as a transformative event, and I think it certainly is. It is demonstrating the character of capitalism, the criminal level of indifference of the corporate financial elite, the complete lack of preparation, which is the product of decades of social counter-revolution on the part of the ruling elites, the transfer of wealth, the endless resources made available to Wall Street, to the military, under Democratic and Republican administrations, has left the country absolutely unprepared to deal with this public health emergency. And the response of the ruling class to the pandemic has been based upon the same interests. First of all, the ignoring and downplaying of its significance, then the utilization of the crisis to implement measures which they had been planning long before to turn over wealth to Wall Street, a bailout of Wall Street in the trillions of dollars. The Federal Reserve balance sheet just this month has increased by $2 trillion. That is money that they've just turned over to the banks and major corporations, buying up assets. The wealthy are getting wealthier out of this crisis. They will utilize it to restructure class relations, increase exploitation. If the ruling class has its way, the consequences, the society that emerges out of this disaster will be characterized by greater inequality, more war, more assaults on democratic rights. It really is demonstrating the necessity for a complete reorganization of social and economic life. And there's a political radicalization. Developments that were already underway, broad-based movement to the left, the growth of opposition in the working class, growing interest in socialism, all that is being intensified enormously by this pandemic. And we're oriented towards the growth of the class struggle. The measures which they are implementing cannot be implemented without massive opposition. There have already been many expressions of this in the growth of strikes and walkouts in the United States and around the world. And our campaign is directed towards building a socialist leadership in the working class to imbue the struggles and the opposition of workers with a clear understanding that the working class faces the historic task of overthrowing capitalism in the United States and all over the world. And that means a implacable struggle against the entire political system, Republicans and Democrats. And the Democratic Party is just as responsible as Republicans for this disaster, whatever their tactical differences. They are absolutely united on basic ruling class policy. The so-called grossly misnamed CARES Act, which sanctioned the multi-trillion-dollar bailout of the banks and the corporate elite, passed unanimously in the Senate. There was not a single vote against it, and that includes Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. There is absolute unanimity within the ruling class on this basic class policy, and also on the return to work, which presidential candidate Biden has also signed on to, and has been promoted by the Democratic Party aligned media. So the Democrats and Republicans represent the ruling class. There can be no expression of the interests of workers within this political system. And the working class has to build a political movement in opposition to it. Now, of course, and perhaps we can speak in greater detail, of course, one of the most important experiences for workers and young people in the course of the past several months has been the experience with the campaign of Bernie Sanders, who presented himself and was presented by various groups around the Democratic Party as a socialist. The outcome of his campaign, as we have warned from the beginning, has been to channel opposition behind the Democratic Party. And he's, of course, ended his election campaign, is enthusiastically supporting Biden, and is seeking to do everything he can to prevent the development of a movement of workers and young people in opposition to the Democratic Party and to the capitalist system.
Thanks. I mean, you raised in your answer then that there have been strikes and protest actions by different sections of workers. Here, the ACTU, which is the peak union body, has been central in creating the conditions where wage working conditions are really being just gutted and eliminated. The government and Sally McManus, who is the secretary of the ACTU, have daily discussions. And Morrison, the Prime Minister, rang her to thank her for her assistance in this. So what is the role of the unions and the unions in the protest and strike actions of US workers who face just a terrible, terrible situation on a national scale?
Well, the short answer is they have absolutely no role whatsoever, or their role is to try to block opposition. There have been many expressions of opposition among workers. One of the early efforts of workers to shut down non-essential production came from auto workers. And that was, earlier on in the spread of this pandemic, when the ruling class was trying to downplay its significance and keep production open. It was the efforts of auto workers in opposition to both the companies and the UAW. The UAW had released statements so they wanted to keep production open. They were going to follow social distancing measures, et cetera, et cetera. And auto workers walked out. They engaged in sick-outs. They engaged in wildcat walkouts. And forced a shutdown of the auto industry. As far as the UAW was concerned, there would have this UAW, which is a corrupt, bought and paid for instrument of the corporations and the ruling class, which is whose top executives are under investigation, or many of them indicted for stealing the dues money of workers and taking bribes from the companies in exchange for pro-corporate contracts. They were going to do absolutely nothing. And all the opposition of Amazon workers, the opposition of Whole Foods, Instacart, Starbucks workers, other sections of the working class. Now there's a growing movement just across the border in Mexico among workers in the maquiladora factories. This has been all independent of the unions. Boeing, as I mentioned, is back to work. The unions are doing nothing. In fact, the unions, the heads of the major unions issued a statement about a week ago, or a week and a half ago, in which they declared that they hoped that the pandemic would become an opportunity to further integrate themselves into corporate management. And they said, very significantly, they said, well, capitalism is undergoing a stress test as a result of the pandemic. They identify the problem as growing opposition to capitalism. They said that it was an appeal to the corporation. It said basically, look, we want to assist you in suppressing opposition, in getting people back to work. Please accept our assistance. These organizations have nothing to do with they're doing nothing to mobilize opposition to the return to work. I mean, in terms of the interests of the working class, the unions play absolutely no role except as an instrument of the ruling elite, of the corporations, of the state. They're corporatist entities, thoroughly integrated into the management framework. The SEP, as with our sister parties in the International Committee, are fighting for the development of rank and file committees, independent organizations of working class struggle that will genuinely represent the interests of working people. And I think that the necessity for such organizations takes on an incredible level of concreteness now. The need to monitor working conditions, to ensure safety, to ensure that non-essential production remains shut, where production is necessary, where it's essential to the functioning of the society. Well, the conditions there have to be controlled by the workers themselves, overseen in close coordination with healthcare professionals. That the profit motive has to be taken out of production. And the opposition, the interests of workers, is not going to be realized, however, within the framework of the trade unions. The workers need to develop their own network of organizations utilizing the technologies available through the internet, other forms of communication, to really develop structures where their interests can be represented.
Joe, if I could just raise a question about the financial situation. I mean, one is staggered by the amounts that are being pumped out. The Fed, the US Federal Reserve, the central bank, now virtually intervenes in every market. We see just trillions of dollars seemingly created out of thin air. Well, the question is, where's value going to come from? The stock market has risen. Where's value going to come from? Who is benefiting? And what's going to flow out of this mountain of debt that has been created by both the government and the central bank?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, as you said, the amounts which have been simply created to turn over to Wall Street are astronomical. It's, of course, a continuation of a longer policy in which the central banks have been utilized, as a method for essentially transferring wealth from the working class to the rich. The employment of so-called quantitative easing measures, that is the buying up of assets, the low interest rates or no interest rates for banks. This has been used, particularly after the 2008 crisis. Such measures were implemented to save the financial system at the expense of the population. Trillions were handed over at the time at that time under the Obama administration. The consequences of that, or it was followed by a complete restructuring of class relations. I mean, it was to be paid for through the exploitation of the working class, through the driving down of wages. Obama in 2009 oversaw the restructuring of the auto industry, which included the halving of wages for new hires, major attacks on healthcare and other benefits, the destruction of jobs. That was the other side of the handover of money to Wall Street. Similar or on an even larger scale, measures are being implemented now in extraordinary speed. I mean, what was done over the course of months and even years after 2008 has been done in the course of weeks or days in response to this pandemic. And it all has to eventually, and so of course now you see over the past month, and we'll see what happens, because the markets are of course highly unstable and it all can come crashing down very, very quickly in response to the situation. I mean, I think it's very, very volatile. You have the situation with oil prices now, which can have a big impact on the markets, but it's been going up over the past month. So Trump at his press conference last week was gloating that the consequence of his policies was that the market was at near record highs, almost what it was before it fell very significantly over the past month. So it's been going up even as the pandemic has been spreading and the death toll has been rising. Where is that all to come from? It has to come from the working class. Ultimately, it has to be paid for the working class. As you've, Nick, explained in many of your articles, I mean, there has to be this has to be paid for. The fictitious capital which has been built up to safeguard the wealth of the corporate and financial elite. Jeff Bezos has increased his wealth by $24 billion just in the course of this month. All of that has to come through the extraction of surplus value from the working class, through labor. And of course, that's the imperative for the return to work. They have to get workers back to producing profits. So you have a really a coordinated campaign now to get workers back to doing that, which is, as far as the ruling class is concerned, that's the purpose of workers, to produce profits. And if that means death, if that means workers are dying, well, that's just going to be part of a fact of life.
Cheryl, I believe you had a question that sort of follows quite directly on from this topic. Did you want to raise that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a question that has been raised previously by a supporter in Goulburn, which is south of Sydney, and also from a supporter in France. And they have asked what the bailouts, these $4 trillion bailouts, what the impact of that will be on the real economy and on the working class itself. Just how does that impact on the lives of ordinary people?
Well, I think that, what I was raising, in all of these policies are expressed class interests. Of course, the media presents such measures, to the extent they even talk about them, as well. It's necessary to save the economy. And that was a justification for the implementation of the CARES Act. In addition to the funneling of money through the Federal Reserve into Wall Street, they have hundreds of billions of dollars in corporate bailouts. But there are class interests which are expressed through such policies. They're handing over money to the rich, and the corollary has to be the increased exploitation of the working class. I think it's important to point out the level of the social crisis in America, which is both brought on by, but also revealed in the pandemic. I mean, you have a level of joblessness now which is extraordinary. One cannot compare the situation to anything previous in American history. Even the Great Depression, in terms of the scale and rapidity of joblessness, 22 million people who filed for unemployment over the past month. And that is by far an underestimate of the real level. It doesn't include, for example, any of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States who do not even qualify for any form of government relief, including unemployment benefits and the $1,200 one-time payout, which people are not getting. There's many reports of people who are not getting unemployment insurance. The situation is catastrophic. People are not able to pay their bills. Of course, they have no job. They have no income, and the ruling class will utilize the situation, if it can, to massively restructure social relations. I mean, many of the conditions, the layoffs will become permanent. There'll be an increase in exploitation. They're handing out money. I mean, they're going to, of course, use this to say, well, of course, there's now no money for the social programs to justify austerity measures. That will be the line from the ruling elite. They will get their pound of flesh from workers in the form of an intensification of exploitation. But of course, that's their aim. That's if they have their way, that will be the consequence. But of course, they have to reckon with the working class itself. As I said, the measures which they are implementing will not come without opposition. We've already seen that, and it's really just the beginning of this process. There is an enormous wellspring of social opposition in the United States, as there is in every country, and the way in which the ruling class has responded to this crisis has vastly intensified those processes.
I would like to raise a sort of two-pronged question, if I could, Joe. They're both related. Firstly, you mentioned Bernie Sanders. Could you address the significance of the Sanders campaign and the support given to it by all sections of the pseudo-left? And the second part of my question is the following. What do you say to those people who, while they may not be part of the pseudo-left organisations, nonetheless advance the argument, well, you know, Sanders is not a genuine socialist, much more is needed, we agree, but his policies did at least represent a step forward in the fight for socialism. There's some kind of improvement, and therefore his campaign should have been supported. What's your reply to those sort of positions?
Yeah, well, I think that expressed in the support for Sanders among broad sections of workers and young people is a distorted expression of a political radicalization. He won the support of millions of workers and particularly youth in the course of the primaries this year, as well as in 2016, because of his rhetorical opposition to social inequality, denunciations of the billionaire class. He was really the only candidate who was speaking to questions of social inequality, of healthcare, and was able to attract support on that basis. And he's was identified in the consciousness of broader sections of the population with socialism, however that is understood. However, the role of Sanders as the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website insisted from the beginning of his 2016 presidential campaign, was and is to attempt to channel that opposition into the Democratic Party. And he's hardly the first to do this. Barack Obama, in his endorsement of Biden last week, referred to Sanders as an American original. Well, he's hardly an American original. You know, this is something which has been this is a political function that has been performed a million times before. How to maintain the political domination of the parties of the ruling elite, and specifically the Democratic Party, and that has been his role, and that has been supported by, as you referred to, innumerable organizations in and around the Democratic Party, most prominently the Democratic Socialists of America, its associated magazine Jacobin, who presented Sanders as the vehicle for achieving socialism. That this was the political revolution, who sanctioned his rhetoric with their own pseudo-left jargon. And what has been the outcome of that? I mean, if you question, well, it's a step forward. I mean, the actual outcome of the Sanders campaign is support for Biden. In the most groveling manner, Sanders has endorsed Biden, has denounced those of his supporters who are opposed to supporting Biden in the election as irresponsible. He's doing as he did in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, the candidate of Wall Street and the military. He's doing everything he can to promote Biden. Of course, in 2016, one of the consequences of that was to create the conditions in which Trump, this fascistic demagogue, was able to posture as the only candidate opposed to the status quo, because the other candidate was Hillary Clinton. Now you have the same thing repeated under conditions of immense political crisis on a far higher level than 4 years ago. You have the same attempt, the promotion of this right-wing personification of the Democratic Party as the party of Wall Street and the military, Biden. Now that's the outcome of the Sanders campaign. That's the real political consequences. And so long as the opposition of workers and young people is subordinated to the Democratic Party, there's no method in which workers can fight for their own interests. So the real purpose, the real political purpose of the Sanders campaign has been to bolster a right-wing party of the corporate and financial elite. And Biden, by the way, the character of his campaign is clear in the ads that he's been putting out, which we haven't spoken about. But one of the responses of the ruling class is to utilize the campaign to intensify their militarism against China. And Biden's ads, the framework of his campaign now is to criticize Trump for not being sufficiently aggressive against China, for allowing China to have its way. And this is a continuation in a new form of the whole framework of their anti-Russia campaign over the past 3.5 years, where they presented the greatest threat to the American people as Vladimir Putin, and the greatest or the center point of their criticism of the Trump administration was that he was not sufficiently aggressive against Russia. So that's the consequences of the Sanders campaign. It's a faction of the Democratic Party, an effort to maintain the political domination of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class over the working class, to smother opposition, to prevent it from taking an independent form. So we absolutely opposed the Sanders campaign, explained its purposes, and are fighting to develop within the working class and among young people a genuine socialist opposition. And all those groups which presented Sanders as the vehicle for achieving a so-called political revolution are themselves completely exposed. Their response, actually, as this political crisis deepens, as the growth of working class opposition grows, their response is to shift ever further to the right. Their principal concern is that there will be the development of a movement of the working class outside of this. You read the articles in Jacobin magazine. Now is not the time to break with the Democratic Party. They're denouncing so-called sectarians, by which they mean the Socialist Equality Party, the World Socialist website, the International Committee. And by sectarians, they mean those who have principled politics, who do not subordinate their politics to the politics of the Democratic Party. That has been their response to these developments. The real growth of opposition is going to come from elsewhere. It's going to come from the growth of the struggles of workers, of young people, and the development of a genuine socialist movement, a genuine socialist leadership.
Now, we are going to open this up for questions from the audience, but there was one more question that Cheryl wanted to ask you, and then we will begin to take questions that have come in throughout the course of this discussion. So, Cheryl?
Yeah, again, another question which has come in previously is that in regards to the campaign against China in the United States, which is certainly not just in the US, but is now very sharp, and as we've outlined, the Democrats have joined vociferously in that campaign. The questioner asks, what does it mean? Why is this happening?
Well, I think Nick's article this morning or this evening in Australia on the World Socialist website is very important in addressing the question of nationalism and the conflict between nation states. The pandemic has revealed the necessity for the global integration of economy, of production, of a response to the pandemic itself, yet the world remains divided by nation states. In particular, the interests of the American ruling class, the interests of imperialism have not gone away. In fact, they're being intensified. The drive against China is certainly now a real focus of the media. There's a coordinated effort to shift attention from the responsibility of the ruling class to the responsibility of China. It involves the Trump administration, its attacks on the WHO, which is being criticized for adapting to China. It involves, as I said, the Democratic Party, the Biden campaign. The this is a continuation of an intensification of their measures over a longer period of time. There's a lot of talk in the United States of the danger that China will utilize this crisis to increase its position. But in fact, American imperialism is seeking to utilize it in order to intensify its campaign against China. And Russia will certainly be brought into this. There have already been attempts at that in the media to blame Russia for misinformation related to coronavirus. The United States, the crisis has exposed the real social, economic, political rot of American capitalism over an extended period of time. The decline of American capitalism, the rise of a parasitic financial oligarchy under conditions in which the world hegemony of the United States is under and has been under protracted decline. The response of the United States has been endless war, the utilization of its military to attempt to offset its declining economic position through global conquest, through endless invasions, occupations, the so-called war on terror, really more than 40 years of endless and expanding war, which, over the course of the past 3 years has developed ever more openly into the framework of great power conflict. The Trump administration has declared that the war on terror is over. Now is the era of a great power conflict with China, with Russia. The strategists of American imperialism have drawn up very detailed plans for world war, for the use of nuclear weapons. That has certainly not gone away with this pandemic, and they're utilizing it to intensify this campaign. It poses the danger of world war. And all the threats which confront mankind, whether it's the pandemic, global warming, world war, really existential questions and dangers. They arise out of the interests of the ruling class and the capitalist system, and pose the urgent necessity for the international unity of the working class in response in the fight for socialism against capitalism.
Now, we have got a number of questions that have come in from the audience, and we will try to field as many as we can, or at least as many topics as we can. Before we get into them, I just want to make an appeal now to everyone who is listening to make as generous a donation as you can to the Socialist Equality Party's monthly fund, which we raise every month. The working class, I think, as is clear from the discussion here tonight and in the previous lectures, is facing life and death issues. Specifically under capitalism, the prospect is inequality, is famine, is war, death, and the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas the fight of the working class is the fight to preserve life and for a socialist reorganization of society. But the most important weapon that the working class requires in this fight is a political program and a political perspective. So I'd like to just add my voice to those who are listening to appeal to you to donate, but to not simply just donate to the Socialist Equality Party. If you are not in Australia, or you're not a resident of Australia, please make your donation to the World Socialist website. This is an international perspective and an international task that confronts the working class. So those who are taking part, we do know we have a number of participants from overseas, which we'll get to very shortly. But really to make the most important decision, which is to apply to join the SEP above all, and take part in the fight for socialism itself through that application. So I just wanted to now turn over to some of the questions. The first question that we have comes from Sydney. It's a quite direct question, in some ways quite simple. Our questioner asks, what would a socialist response be to a pandemic? So how would a socialist program respond to and deal with a global pandemic?
In the course of this pandemic, the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website has advanced a definite program that we have called upon workers to take up, specifically in relationship to the pandemic, the demand that a non-essential production be halted, that where production is necessary for the functioning of society, that workers be protected, that full protective equipment be made available. We've insisted that workers who are affected by the pandemic receive their full income, the necessity for paid sick leave. All of this is that those who are impacted are made whole. The working class cannot be made to pay for this disaster. There has to be a massive expenditure of social resources to build up healthcare infrastructure. Over the course of the past 4 decades, the healthcare system has been devastated. Hospitals closing. The policy of bipartisan policy of the ruling class has been to attack healthcare. There has to be a massive investment in healthcare infrastructure. Everyone has to have the right to the highest quality healthcare. The building up of necessary life-saving equipment. One of the sort of expressions of the criminal lack of preparation on the part of the ruling class has been the fact that there have been insufficient ventilators to deal with the crisis. As a result of the fact that they just didn't produce them. The plans that they had were subordinated to the profit interests of various corporations under Obama, and before him under Bush, and after under Trump, and nothing was done. I mean, so we have advanced a program, but none of this can be achieved without a frontal attack on the wealth of the corporate and financial elite. I mean, they say there's no money to make sure that everyone has a decent income, that resources are made available to address the social crisis. You have food lines of miles, which are now emerging. It's sort of scenes of the Great Depression, and at the same time, resources are just being turned over to the wealthy. If you take even a 90% wealth tax on the richest 400 Americans, you have resources which would be sufficient to provide for the basic necessities of the working class. But I think that what it really is exposing in every instance, the necessity for planning, for production on the basis of social need and not private profit. If one considers the food supply system, if one considers the logistics system, of course, the healthcare system, why is any of this subordinated to the profit interests of gigantic corporations? You have workers who are providing essential social services in delivering food to people who should not be leaving their homes, who are making $7 an hour plus tips, who are working under unsafe conditions. All of this should be run democratically in the interests of social need, that the interests of the working class have to have priority, not the interests of the corporations. The whole crisis is demonstrating the necessity for economic planning on a world scale in the interests of social need. And what is required to achieve that? The expropriation of separate industries, the transformation of the healthcare industry, of Amazon, the transportation industry, of the grocery stores and corporations. All of this must be turned, and of course of the banks, above all. They have to be transformed into public utilities, run on the basis of social need, on the basis of a scientific, rational plan, that resources have to be made available to ensure that everyone has health care, that there are measures in place to address a pandemic like this, that there is sufficient testing, that these resources have to be made available. But it has to be based upon a society in which the process of production is run on the basis of social need rather than private profit. That basic principle of socialism, I think, acquires an incredible concreteness in relationship to this pandemic. How would a socialist society respond to it? You know, the necessary changes in the process of production, the allocation, the redirection of production on the basis of social need, not the imperative of profit. Why is this drive now for a return to work, this coordinated campaign? Well, they have to produce profits. They have to pay for what they've turned over to the ruling class. But the whole framework of the discussion, the false choice which is being presented to the population of the United States and the world, the choice between economic destitution and going back to work under unsafe conditions, where they can contract the virus, where they can spread it to their families, where they endanger their lives and the lives of their loved ones, of their friends and family. That choice is premised upon the acceptance of capitalism, the acceptance that that society has to be run in the interest of profit. But you take that out, well, of course, you have a very different response. The necessity, you know, the workers under these conditions have to be made whole. That non-essential production has to be shut for the duration of the pandemic. That the whole framework of existing socially necessary production is based upon ensuring the health of the workers, the necessary diversion of social resources. But again, all of that is premised upon the existence of a society in which the imperative is not private profit, the accumulation of wealth, but the imperative is social need. I hope that begins to address the question.
Yes, and I would direct our listeners to review some of the articles and statements that have been posted on the World Socialist website, particularly pertaining to a socialist program to respond to the pandemic. I wanted to take this question here from someone from Timor-Leste, from East Timor. He has two questions. Asks, if you are elected as a real socialist president of the United States, would world history will there ever be a new socialist president of the United States? And what is your political strategy to restructure the international system as the socialist president of the US? They note we face great challenges from major global capitalist states such as Russia, China, the European Union, India, etc. Secondly, asks why we can't build socialist order or socialist economy within the capitalist system. So could you raise your vision to build a new socialist state from electoralism, so from parliamentarism in the United States? Do you aim to forge a radical break with capitalism, or do you attempt to reform it into reformist politics? So, you know, under the conditions in which you are elected as president of the United States, what would you do, Joe?
Yes, thank you for that question and for participating. Well, you know, in these elections, we are going to fight for as many votes as we can. One of the challenges is, I think, perhaps internationally, it's not quite understood how anti-democratic the electoral system is in the United States. Even getting on the ballot, particularly under the conditions of the pandemic, is very, very difficult. We will campaign for votes, but we're also under no illusions that the political system is in any fundamental sense democratic and expressive of the real interests of the population. I don't anticipate to be moving my residencies to the White House come January 1st. Of course, if conditions had begun to emerge where the Socialist Equality Party was winning in elections, that would indicate a level of social and political conflict in this country, which would have revolutionary consequences. The central aim of our campaign, in that sense, we're not oriented, in essence, to electoral politics. The purpose of our campaign is to fight to build a political leadership in the working class. We're oriented to the growth of the class struggle, the development of a revolutionary movement in the working class in the United States and around the world, which will fight for a complete restructuring of social, economic, and political life. And that's the aim of our campaign, where our campaign is directed to the growth of opposition in the working class, to building a socialist leadership. That's simply a question of, what I will do upon being elected, or the social, our candidates will do, but upon what the working class will do, what the working class will fight for, what the working class will take up as its political strategy and perspective for responding to this crisis. And we're fighting to build a political leadership, a vanguard in the working class to lead these struggles. Workers have to take up this fight for socialism, for a revolutionary movement throughout the world to put an end to capitalism, to establish a workers' government, a government of, by, and for the working class that will take control of the gigantic corporations and banks and run them on the basis of its interests, on the basis of social need. We're fighting to build a revolutionary movement in the working class. That's in the international working class. I mean, I'm not sure if I quite understood the question. You referred to the great challenges from India and other countries in the United States. I mean, the interests of workers in every country are the same, are fundamentally united. The workers are exploited by the same corporations. They face the same conditions, and their interests are united. We're fighting to build a movement in the international working class. Just to return to the theme at the beginning, our campaign is not, as we said in launching it, it's not oriented simply to workers in the United States. It's directed at workers throughout the world. These are global questions. There is no national solution to any of the problems facing the working class. So we're fighting to build a revolutionary leadership in the working class. I would just say that is getting a powerful response. We see in many forms, indications that the perspective that our movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist movement, has fought for over the course of decades, the perspective of world socialist revolution, of internationalism. That perspective is now intersecting with a radicalization in the working class. The reality is demonstrating the correctness of that perspective, the bankruptcy of capitalism, the inability to achieve anything within the framework of the existing political institutions. We're seeing a very significant growth in the readership of the World Socialist website, growing support for our party, growing recruitment among workers and young people. There is an enormous developing audience for such a perspective that only our movement, on the basis of its history and program, only our movement fights for. But that's the fundamental orientation of our election campaign. We're fighting to build a leadership in the working class. The working class has to fight for this. The role and the objective reality is proving the necessity for world socialism. But that objective necessity has to be turned into a conscious political movement, a conscious leadership. Workers have, as you say, the main conclusion we want is for workers to join, young people to join this party, because we have to build a political leadership, a political party that will turn this objective process into a subjective a political movement for socialism in the United States and around the world. That's the aim of our election campaign. That's the orientation of our election campaign.
And just to reiterate that,
reforms within the existing social system, we have no illusions that the political system can be, the existing political structures can be turned into instruments that represent the interests of working class. We're building a revolutionary movement in the working class, and we're utilizing the election campaign as a method for fighting for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really important points. And just to reiterate them, I mean, if you want to take up the fight for socialism, you should make an application in order to join this party, and we will educate you and train you as a Marxist. Now, we've gotten a few questions that have come in from about the situation in the United States, specifically in the role of the right wing. One questioner asks if you could comment on the recent demonstrations that have been promoted here in the news. I mean, they're getting wall-to-wall coverage, calling for the reopening of business, and which are being openly supported by President Trump. A second question asking if you could, just referring to a photograph that we had on the presentation with the caption, "Right-wing forces have been promoted in the US military." Could you speak more on the promotion of and the development of right-wing forces in the military? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, the protests have a very, very manufactured character. You watch the news here, and they're leading with these demonstrations of a handful of people, ultra-right forces. You include people holding up swastika flags, and it's being very consciously promoted by the Trump administration, but also by the media. They're trying to sort of create a narrative of a mass groundswell of opposition to the measures which have been implemented to prevent the expansion of the pandemic. And of course, they're utilizing or attempting to utilize the real social distress of millions of workers. I was referring to, create the false choice between economic destitution and a return to work under unsafe conditions. But the real sentiment, and this is expressed in polls, many polls that have been conducted, the real sentiment of workers is that they don't want to work under conditions in which they're endangering their lives and the lives of their loved ones. The real oppositional movement, as it's developed over the past month, has been a demand to shut down non-essential production, to stop unsafe working conditions. The immense opposition among service workers, they're referred to auto workers. There is not a sort of mass movement for an end to social distancing measures. There's enormous concern about the impact of the coronavirus among workers. So the demonstrations have had a highly manufactured character, sort of promoted very deliberately by the Trump administration, the media, to create this narrative. They are, more broadly, the cultivation of the far right, which the questioner raises. The Trump administration has, throughout its tenure, sought to cultivate such forces. We haven't referred to, but the announcement from just last night here in U.S. time that Trump is planning to shut down all immigration to the United States. He tweeted at about 10 p.m. last night that he's going to issue an executive order to stop all immigration. They are, the Trump administration is utilizing the crisis to pursue very, very reactionary ends, and they have sought to cultivate such fascistic forces, to utilize it as a battering ram against the growth of opposition in the working class. But the whole political establishment and the media is culpable in this. The Democratic Party has sought throughout the past 3.5 years to oppose Trump, not for his fascistic policies, for the concentration camps on the U.S.-Mexico border, but for supposedly being too soft on Russia. That's been the framework of their opposition. They've sought to oppose Trump on the most right-wing basis possible. But there is, from the Trump administration, the efforts to cultivate far-right forces, authoritarian methods of rule, but it expresses the interests of the corporate financial oligarchy. I mean, the levels of social inequality that prevail in the United States are incompatible with democratic forms of rule, and Trump expresses that. He didn't come out of nowhere. He is the noxious expression, the vomiting up in American politics of levels of social inequality which are incomprehensible, of endless war. That has produced Donald Trump, the Trump administration. And I think that essential social political fact is revealed in how the whole ruling class has responded to this, to the pandemic.
I would like to just go back to the question of Sanders, because I think, as with your town hall debate, I mean, this is a major issue in Australia and really internationally. A listener from Lake Macquarie asks, the assertion that Bernie Sanders' Democratic Socialist campaign was an insincere sham, primarily designed not to win the election but to divert revolutionary sentiment instead into the Democratic Party, is plausible. But could you please explain the evidence behind this assertion?
Well, as I say, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, everything that he's done has demonstrated that. In terms of what he's said is from the beginning. If you actually carefully followed his rhetoric, when he talks about a political revolution, it was always his explanation was, well, we have to bring young people and workers into the political system. His main selling point for the Democratic Party and the media has been that he was the candidate who could encourage young people to back the Democratic Party. He could get voter turnout. Sanders he's not a new phenomenon. I mean, he has a long political history in the Democratic Party and around the Democratic Party. He's nominally an independent, but he's functioned as a member of the Democratic Party for decades. After 2016, when the first election campaign, where he got 13 million votes from workers and youth in the course of the Democratic Party primaries, and then proceeded to back Hillary Clinton, he was rewarded for his services with a position in the Democratic Party caucus in the United States Senate, working closely with the Democratic Party leadership in the implementation of policy. What his response to the Trump administration was entirely in line with that of the Democratic Party. First, saying that pledging to work with Trump. That was one of his initial statements after the election of Trump, that he wanted to work with Trump on the implementation of economic policies, particularly trade war measures. And then the whole anti-Russia campaign, which he never once criticized, never once raised the phenomenon of CIA Democrats, never once criticized Democratic Party foreign policy, militarism. I mean, the whole framework of his politics is that of Democratic Party politics, with a certain left, gloss, a certain left proposals. Medicare for all became his sort of calling card, the stock and trade demand that he raised, but never, never saying anything about the role of the Democratic Party, the Obama administration. Never once criticizing the Obama administration. He has a long record of backing war, of supporting American imperialism, going back to his support for the Yugoslav war in the late 90s, the war in Afghanistan. He is a Democratic Party politician. That's what he is. Of course, he has a certain rhetoric which attracted support among workers and young people for healthy reasons. They saw in him somehow an instrument for opposing social inequality, but that has proven false. And what he's doing in relationship to the Biden campaign demonstrates. And I think young people, they're sickened by it. They're trying to sort of work through what this means. He was supposed to be leading a political revolution. He was talking, the establishment hates him, and now he says, well, everyone's got to back Biden, who has, in his long career supported every measure of the ruling class, austerity. He voted for the Iraq War, which led to the deaths of more than 1 million people. He voted for the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which deregulated American banks and created the conditions for this disaster. Now, his political revolution has turned into support for Biden. His slogan, "Not me, us," has become "Not me, Joe Biden." This is demonstrating the character of what the Sanders campaign was about. And we warned about this. We have a long experience with this type of politics. It's been done before, whether it's Jesse Jackson or, various claims that the Democratic Party could be reformed. In fact, with a more radical demands than Sanders has. But this our analysis has proven correct as to his role. And he, in a certain sense, is doing everything, and not just him, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, others, in the Democratic Socialists of America. He's doing everything he can. It's as if he wanted to demonstrate, look, the Socialist Equality Party was right. This is what I am. This is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to show to you that they were right. And that's what he's the act that he's performing in the course of this election. But the sentiment of workers and young people is going to find more radical forms. They're going through experiences. They have to, to address the question of the role of the DSA. They've been promoting it. The real role of a socialist leadership is to explain to workers the character of such political tendencies, to develop an understanding among workers of the necessity to understand politics in class terms, to judge political figures not by what they say of themselves, but by their political record, the program of the party that they represent, their history, and on that basis, develop a political orientation. That's what the Socialist Equality Party has done in relationship to the Sanders campaign, and of course it's not just Sanders. It's an international phenomenon. Corbynism, what has become of that? The idea that you could transform the Labour Party in the UK has produced, the return of Blairism, the bankruptcy of Corbynism. You have the experience of Syriza in Greece, which came to power and implemented the policies of the banks and corporations. You have the experience of the Left Party in Germany, which is seeking a political alliance with right-wing forces, has implemented austerity, supports German remilitarization. This is an international phenomenon with such, there's an international experience with such tendencies, and workers have to draw conclusions from it, that a real socialist leadership has to be built, not an appendage of bourgeois politics.
And I just want to take this point to pause for a minute and point our participants' attention to a special offer that is available from Merring Books. And really raises all of the issues that we've been discussing here tonight for a socialist perspective. One really requires socialist literature. These 4 books, as we say on the slide, draw the lessons of the most fundamental strategic experiences of the international working class in the 20th century, providing an essential introduction to this perspective of world socialist revolution advanced by the Trotskyist movement. And of course, anyone who is seeking a genuine socialist perspective in opposition to that of Sanders, in opposition to that of the pseudo-left of identity politics, needs to make their study, and these 4 books are an absolutely seminal beginning. Why Study the Russian Revolution, Volumes 1 and 2, which you can get as a bundle for $32 plus postage. Why Are They Back for $20, and The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century by David North for $24.95. If you do live in Australia, you can make your orders through merring@aussiemail.com.au. Simply email that email address. Indicate you would like to get the bundle of all 4 books, and postage will be free for those 4 books. If you live outside of Australia, you can make your purchase through merring.com. I wanted to just ask a question. There's a number of questions that have been raised on this particular theme, asking what are the new tools or weapons or strategies that socialists have to progress a political education campaign. I'm relatively new to socialism and struggle to see hope in the utilization of old methodologies. Joe, if you could answer that.
Well, the greatest tool is the World Socialist website, which is the daily publication of our international movement, which every day advances a socialist analysis of developments in a socialist program for the working class. We are seeking to develop around the World Socialist website the publication of the International Committee of the Fourth International, a worldwide movement in the working class for socialism, and to develop a consciousness, to educate workers, to train workers politically, and to develop a socialist leadership. That's the greatest tool, I think, for the development of the socialist movement. And of course, through the online forums, through social media, the internet, new forms of communication, even, this meeting, I think, is an expression of the ability of the socialist movement to utilize the developments in technology to develop a world movement for socialism. I mean, this expresses that. In all of the writings from think tanks of the ruling class in recent years, noting the growth of mass social unrest internationally, and there have been many, they've pointed to the significance of social media, of the internet to unite the working class, to spread information outside of the constraints of the establishment media, the gatekeepers of information, and they pointed to the dangers that represents. We have enormous tools at our disposal. The changes in communication the working class is integrated in a way which was never before possible through the process of production, the global character production, and through the global forms of communication. And there are immense resources that have to be utilized by workers to unify their struggles, to share information. And all of that has to be utilized to the full. The World Socialist website is the conscious expression in its highest form of the strivings of the working class for international unity, for the building of socialist leadership. So I would encourage if you're listening, if you're new to socialism, to first of all read the World Socialist website. It is an invaluable tool. Our record we have an extraordinary record in warning about specifically the coronavirus pandemic, the consequences of elaborating a worldwide strategy to fight it, but more broadly, a record of the fight to educate the working class and develop a socialist leadership in the international working class. That the World Socialist website has to be built. It has to be developed. We have to fight against the efforts of the ruling class to censor the WSWS. We have to fight for an increase in its readership, to make it known among workers and youth, as part of the fight to build the socialist leadership. And I would again encourage everyone listening to this call, if you're not already a member of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia or New Zealand, or if you're listening outside of that, to join the Socialist Equality Party to fight to build sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International in the country where you live, and to join this movement.
I wanted to, in particular, draw your attention to the May Day rally that we will be holding in Sydney time. It will be on May the 3rd, right in the morning. It is at the unenviable hour of 1 a.m., which is, of course, a time that is free from all other engagements. I'm sure as Joe will attest to, in taking part at 5 a.m. this morning in today's discussion. These are international questions, and the fight for the international unification of the working class takes a concrete and conscious form in the May Day rallies that we've been holding since 2014. It brings together workers, socialist-minded youth, professionals, young people, to hear reports and outline a perspective for the working class. And of course now, under the conditions of the global pandemic and crisis, the question of May Day takes an added and even greater significance. I wanted to thank and give a particular thank to Joe for sacrificing his sleep and his time to take part in this discussion here tonight. And just to reiterate the points that he's made in his final answer, I mean, we are bringing this particular series to a close, but in that sense, nothing is really over. The question now is what conclusions you draw from the material that has been presented in these talks. The capitalist class and its political defenders, whether they are in Parliament or without Parliament, which includes the pseudo-left, the trade unions, the gamut of political defenders that we have identified and demarcated from throughout the course of these lectures. Now the working class has to determine what its response is going to be. And above all, that requires a turn to a socialist program and perspective. So as Joe had indicated, purchase our statement of principles. It is for $5 and can be purchased and ordered if you're in Australia through Mering at aussiemail.com.au. Make a study of it. And if you agree with its principles, then make an application to join the SEP, to join the IYSSE, and take part in the fight for a socialist perspective and future for mankind. So thank you everyone for your participation, not just in this lecture, but in all the previous ones, your questions, your comments, and of course your donations. Have a good night or a good morning.
Thank you everyone, and good night.